And we're here, of course, because of this man, for an evening or part of an evening with Simon Winchester. Now, you all already know Simon, I'm sure. That's why you're here. You know him the way you're meant to know authors, through his books. And his writing, including The Surgeon of Crowthorne, which I have here, my own copy, dated in my own fair hand, 1998. The Map That Changed the World, Bomb, Book and Compass, and his latest, this one here, Pacific, The Ocean of the Future. Now, luckily for us, Simon is an avid, I'd even say inexhaustible traveller, I think, from all I can read of you, which is how he comes to be here at our end of the world in what he calls in his book one of the Pacific cities. And to this very stage, giving us the chance to get to know him and his books that little bit better. Think of our chat here tonight as a missing page, a little something added to those books that you love or those that you haven't yet read. We've got just 1 hour together, including time for questions from the audience. So let's get started. Welcome to you, Simon, very warmly.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great to have you here. Now, to that question, is it true? Does Melbourne count as a Pacific city? Given that we've got, what, a bay and a strait and a sea between us and the Pacific?
I think it does. I think everything to the east of the railway that connects Adelaide to Darwin can rightly be regarded as Pacific Australia, in the same way that everything to the west of the Mississippi, including the Rockies and the Sierras, can be regarded as Pacific America. I mean, as far as my book is concerned, anyway, yes.
Well, yes, and Australia gets a good serve in both senses of that word, I think, in your book. Earlier in 2010, you wrote the biography of the Atlantic Ocean. And so I can see why you might naturally have thought of tackling a book on the Pacific to kind of colour in the other side of the globe. And did you know that the Pacific occupies 1/3 of the planet's entire surface area? You probably did. I didn't know that. That's
and could accommodate all the continents with ease.
Within it.
There's that wonderful line from Robinson Jeffers, the American poet, who calls it the great unsleeping eye of the Earth. If you see it from space and the Earth is turned the right way, it just looks like an enormous, it occupies all of the visible hemisphere, a big blue thing. And as Arthur C. Clarke said, it was extraordinary, was it not, that we call the planet Earth, because if you see it from space, you really should call it sea.
Yes.
There's so much more of it.
Of course, you have a strong connection with the Atlantic, that's obvious, but you have a strong connection with the Pacific as well, don't you? I mean, you were a journalist based in Hong Kong for, 10 years, 12 years?
13, actually.
In the 80s and 90s, and I guess you ranged right across the Asia-Pacific.
I worked for The Guardian, and The Guardian is a newspaper that everyone, at least in those days, would love to have been able to afford to work for, because they pay you very little, and they only have sort of one person every dotted around the globe. So my patch extended from, I suppose, Rangoon, I suppose, in the west, to Hokkaido in the east, and then up to Siberia in the north. And they would send me to all of these places. So I would go to, Petropavlovsk or Dunedin or Bangkok or Tokyo. And so I saw a lot of the Pacific. And, Fiji and Tonga and Solomon Islands, because there was a lot happening when I was there, independence movements, and so I saw an awful lot of Prince Charles in his white swan's down hat.
Certainly your grasp, not just of the places and the people, but of the geopolitical stakes of the Pacific show themselves strongly in your book. And it gives the book a real authority, also that sense of you having been there on the ground. But I get the feeling that when it came to thinking about the shape that this book was going to take, you found it a trickier proposition than the Atlantic as a book. What was it like trying to find a frame to fit so vast a subject in?
Well, what people don't seem to mention out of tact, I think, and kindness to me, is that I actually had written a book about the Pacific a long time ago in the 1990s, when I was living in Hong Kong, actually, and it was horrible. I mean, it was horribly organized, and I was overwhelmed by it.
So this is your second go?
This is, well, in a sense, a third go, because I also wrote a sort of novel about the Pacific. That actually didn't do too badly, and it was about a very specific aspect of the Pacific. But no, with this I decided, because I'm a great believer that in writing non-fiction there are three terribly important things, which the first, obviously the most important thing in any book is the idea. You've got to have an idea that people are interested in, I hope. But it's tempting to think that the next good thing is the writing. But that's not actually the case, I don't think. I think the next most important thing is the structure of the book.
Yes.
I mean, you can write lyrically about a brilliant idea, but if the structure's all wrong, then you'll lose people, they'll go to sleep, they'll just put the book down. So the structure is hugely important. I mean, writing is important, and it's nice to write nicely if you can. But the structure, and it clearly eluded me in the earlier book. So I was determined to at least try and get it right for this. And the model turned out to be a book of a writer I'd never really heard of until I went to see that movie, the Grand Budapest Hotel.
Yes.
And it said that the writer, the quote writer, the sort of narrator of the film was this Austrian author called Stefan Zweig. And by extraordinary coincidence, I had picked up Stefan Zweig, a child of the late part of the fin de siècle, really, in Austria, Jewish family, terribly rich, very well connected, and he wrote brilliantly. And for 20 years, from about 1918 to about 1938, he was inarguably the most popular English writer of his time. Everyone read Stefan Zweig's books, novels, biographies, anthologies, all sorts of stuff. But then he became a refugee because he's Jewish, and what had happened in Central Europe, came to first London, then to America, and then utterly depressed by the state of the world, he and his then second wife moved to Brazil, where they killed themselves by drinking veronal and are found lying in their hotel bedrooms. And it was a tragic and early end to a remarkable life. But he left behind this remarkable legacy, one of them being a biography of Magellan, which I read without even really knowing who it was by, and I thought this is wonderful. And then by writing an extraordinary book with many, many different titles, but essentially the English title was Shooting Stars, 10 events that changed the world. And one of them was the discovery of the Pacific by Balboa, not as most school chums of mine and me believed Cortez. And that, of course, was because Keats wrote in that poem on first looking into Chapman's Homer that there stood I like proud, stout Cortez on a peak in Darien. And he showed this, he wrote it very late at night and came down the following morning and showed it to his English professor, effectively, who said, no, Keats, it wasn't Cortez that discovered the Pacific standing on that peak in Darien in Panama. It was Balboa. And Keats said, well, I know, but Balboa has 3 syllables.
It doesn't scan.
And it doesn't scan. So would you mind awfully, poetic license, if I kept it? And so generations of school children, me included, thought for ages that Cortez had nothing to do with it. Anyway, so that was one of the essays in Stefan Zweig's books. There was another essay about, the trial of Cicero and the composition of the Marseillaise, and also it's an eccentrically arranged but utterly readable list. I mean, I do commend it to you to read, as indeed all The Post Office Girl and The Chess Puzzle, wonderful books by this now very much overlooked author. So anyway, it was his. I know this is a very long answer, but I will finish in about 5 more seconds. It was that book of 10 essays that made me think I should write 10 essays about the Pacific.
Which is what we end up with, 10 chapters. You call the Pacific in the subtitle here, the ocean of the future, and the book is a modern history of the Pacific. The ostensible starting point that you take, you cleverly use the date of 1st of January 1950, a date that came to be defined as the present, for reasons you explain in a kind of introductory chapter, an 11th chapter, titled On Carbon. Can you talk about that, about the present and 1950? I know it's kind of complicated, but
Well,
you
I
can
was
do
going
it.
to say complicated and potentially extremely boring, so I try not to make it so. But basically, I mean, when I wanted a starting point for the book, and I didn't want to do Balboa, I didn't want to do Cortes, obviously, didn't want to do Magellan, Cook, Dampier, Tasman, all these people, take them as a given. I thought, let's start it at a more modern moment. And I thought of the surrender of the Japanese on the 2nd of September 1945, or the forming of the People's Republic of China on the 10th of October 1949. But then came this date, the 1st of January 1950, and it came about, first of all, for a peculiar reason. We've all been accustomed, I think most of us here, to date things according to whether they occurred BC, before Christ, or today, Anno Domini, AD. But for those of us who aren't Christians, or rather for those who aren't Christians, that's irrelevant, insulting, offensive to some people. And so there was a sort of fudge, which was BCE, which some people use now, before Christian era or before Common Era. But for the scientific community, that wasn't really good enough either. And they, 40 or 50 years ago, came up with another convention, which was BP. And so you talk about the Wisconsin Ice Age, let's say, occurring 10,000 years BP, BP standing for before present, which prompts the question, well, when is present? And they decided, and it was a group of radiochemists at Queen's University, Belfast, that present should be the index year, the index moment, should be the 1st of January 1950, because up to that point, this newfangled but highly accurate dating technique, carbon dating, was accurate. Everyone knew there was a baseline ratio, and this is where it could get boring, that for every 1 trillion atoms of carbon-12, which is a stable isotope of carbon, there was 1 atom of the highly unstable isotope carbon-14, which has a half-life of 5,730 years. And so knowing that, and knowing that things stop absorbing carbon when they die, working out how much carbon, what the ratio is in the dead thing, you can work out when it died. So that was, up to 1950, a perfectly accurate way of determining when something organic had died. Very, very useful. However, come 1950, we started testing nuclear weapons. And one of the byproducts, both of fission bombs and fusion bombs, in other words, atomic bombs or thermonuclear weapons, is carbon-14 in very large quantities. So it's pumped up into the atmosphere, and suddenly this ratio, this sort of holy grail of 1 trillion to 1, started to become distorted. Yeah. And the scientific community had to introduce algorithms each year, more and more extreme algorithms to keep the calculations accurate. So before 1950, the world was pure, and after 1950, it was impure. And from my point of view, almost all of those impurities were generated in the Pacific.
In the Pacific.
So
Perfect.
it seemed to have a certain logic to it.
It does, as an ocean of the future. The present started there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Yeah, I love it.
Well, I'm delighted, thank you. I thought it was that chapter might have been a bit troublesome, but...
And I knew it was a challenge asking you to encapsulate that, but you did so beautifully. Thank you, Simon. Many of the events that you use as the pivot points, as the starting points for your 10 chapters, are suitably maritime, involving ships and canoes, submarines, submersibles, even surfboards. I like the way... the 1972 sinking of an ocean liner, appropriately named the Queen Elizabeth in Hong Kong Harbour, heralds the beginning of the end of empire, or the end of the beginning of the end of the end. Yeah, thank you. You range backwards and forwards from that one event to tell a much bigger story, as you do in each of your chapters. And likewise, for instance, with the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991, that's a trigger for your, I think, brilliant exploration of China's growing boldness and ambition in the Pacific. And the devastation caused by Cyclone Tracy in 1974, that builds into a story of the Pacific as the weather engine of the planet. I'm interested that you use as one of your starting points the dismissal of the Whitlam government as the event that kicks off Chapter 7, which is titled How Goes the Lucky Country. You write, the role of this one continental country will play in the future remains a mystery to most. In Australia, as among its millions of neighbours, Australia is an overwhelmingly non-Pacific nation on the western edge of the ocean. Does it fit? Can it fit? What do you think?
Well, I mean, this in a way is when I set off from New York last week, I thought, well, should I bite my fingernails? Are they going to be nice? Are they not? But generally speaking, people have been nice about it. But I think my view is that, and I took the dismissal as a sort of symbolic moment when, if you like, the last tug of the leash from Buckingham Palace briefly stopped Australia in her tracks and the government changed and all the rest of it. And that ever since, the question of whether this is a part of the Pacific community or whether it's still an outpost of Old England, that debate seems to have been more or less settled. At least it had been until the arrival of Pauline Hanson. And then suddenly, briefly, it seemed that there was this undertow that suddenly wanted to say, well, we're not really a member of the Pacific community. We don't want an awful lot of the people that are part of the community coming here. We don't want to spoil the innate whiteness, if you like, of Australia. I mean, you remember that two whites don't make a Wong and all those terrible remarks that were made back then.
That's right, that lingers.
But I think that's all been beaten down now. And I think Australia, with the single exception now of this extraordinarily immigration policy, which seems to me, anyway, from the outside, and of course we in the States are debating it at the moment, and things are being said largely by the Republicans, which are very similar to things that are being said by some of the more Neanderthal politicians here. I'm sorry, what I mean is... Well, I hope I'll try and be polite, but I think the majority view in Australia is that we're on the Pacific, we're in the Pacific. The Indonesians and the Cambodians and the Chinese and the Japanese, we're part of that rather than people from, Surrey and Scotland, and that's history. This is today, this is tomorrow, and we've got to deal with it, and the next generations are certainly going to deal with it. So let the undertow be stilled and let Australia be what geography has determined that she should be.
Indeed. I wonder, and you certainly talk about climate change and its potential, or existing and potential impacts in the Pacific, but I wonder whether we'll end up being a large part of the Pacific solution ourselves, our immigration solution, offshore processing and settlement has been called the Pacific solution, but I think that's going to be turned back on us somehow.
I wonder. I mean, certainly those three islands are pretty shameful places.
Yeah, but as the sea levels rise, people are going to have to go somewhere.
Yeah.
We've got a big island here.
Well, you've got a huge island here.
Yeah. I just said something off the cuff, which I had written here. Well done, Robin. Sorry. I bet that tonight's audience, many of you at least, first became familiar with your work, Simon, as I did through the Surgeon of Crowthorne back in 1998 when it first came in. Yep. I was working in a bookshop at that time, and I remember how that book in particular was the first to really confound our categories of shelving. Where did it belong? And it seemed that almost single-handedly you reinvented and reinvigorated narrative non-fiction that gave, and a surge followed.
Well, it's very nice of you to say so, but Borders in America, which when it existed, when it survived, based in Ann Arbor in Michigan, had no idea where to put this book, but filed it under travel.
Yeah.
So, really peculiar.
It was a fascinating thing to see.
What happened to Borders?
I used to love going around to different bookshops and finding out where yours had ended up. I mean, the beauty for you, I think, is that one of the consequences was because people didn't know where to put it, they didn't put it away. They left it out on display because they didn't know which category to shelve it in. How do you explain the popularity of it? I mean, it must have come as a surprise. It was just a wallop of popularity, that book. Great book.
Yes, well, I mean, I can certainly tell you a very long story about that, but I should say, first of all, that the publisher had no idea, and they printed 10,000 copies. They just thought a book on 19th century lexicography.
It seems very niche.
Very niche, yes, well, travel, whatever. But anyway, but it did sell, and then after it sold, my editor, a very remarkable man called Larry Ashmead, sadly no longer with us, he sat me down because we were planning what to do next. And he said the success of the Surgeon, in America it's called The Professor and the Madman. He said the success, he thought, was due to the fact that it was about a hitherto unknown person who made a major contribution to human society. The trajectory of his life was dramatically up and dramatically down, and because, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, because he cut off his penis at one stage, and it involved grotesque bodily mutilation. So he said to me, Simon, planning the next book, do you know anybody else like that? And oddly enough, I didn't, although I sort of did, and went off in pursuit of this fellow, a chap called Adolphus Washington Greeley, and I actually went with an Australian woman up to northern Ellesmere Island in Canada to tell the story of this man who was hitherto unknown, did remarkable stuff, the trajectory of his life was tragically up and down, and was involved in a big cannibalism scandal. So I thought that would suit the bill. But unfortunately, when I went down to the Library of Congress in Washington, I found that another man had been riffling through his notes, and I was able to find his name and rang him up. He turned out to be a 75-year-old Welshman living in Charleston, South Carolina, who had been working for 25 years on this man, and I thought it would be unchristian to steal the book away from him. So I took it back to the publisher, and with this mantra, unknown, major contribution, trajectory, grotesque bodily mutilation, I looked for someone else and remembered dimly from my days at university when I studied geology, a man called William Smith, who created the first geological map of the world. And I looked him up in Britannica. There was a very sort of perfunctory entry, but it said, creator of the first geological map in the world. His map was plagiarized. He became bankrupt. He went to debtor's prison. His wife went mad, and she became a nymphomaniac. So I thought, this is it, because this was the time, do you remember, of that fellow Bobbitt, Wayne Bobbitt?
Yes.
She didn't do that, it turned out, but nonetheless, nymphomania was for me the solution to the problem.
I wondered about its popularity, and I certainly shared your editor's view that the genital mutilation...
It helps.
It helps, yes.
Push the story along.
It helped...
Can I just tell a brief, tiny story? I know we should be talking about the Pacific. The day I discovered this, I was in the archives.
I pictured this.
What?
How you must have been when you read that.
Well, it was amazing. I was in the archives in Broadmoor Lunatic Asylum, and I suddenly came across this piece of paper. Everything hitherto had been written in beautiful copperplate, but this was a hurriedly scribbled note by a guard in pencil. And it said, at 8:30, Dr. Miner came to the front gate and said, quick, I need a doctor. Why, said I, the guard, what appears to be the problem? And he said, I've just sliced off my penis and thrown it into the fire. Well, when I read this, I thought, my gosh, because I knew that the work rate at the dictionary had fallen off somewhat. He was on the letter Q, I think, and the people at Oxford were saying, where's Dr. Miner, what he's doing? So you could sense that would be a good reason for, make your eyes sting at the very least. And so I was exultant, almost sort of dancing in the corridors. I found this thing. And I went up to Oxford that afternoon, and I sort of announced, I went to the floor of the OED, and I said, I now know why in 1902 Dr. Miner stopped working for a while, because he did this. And they were amazed, and there was applause. And then I caught the train that afternoon, late afternoon, to go back to London. And the train was one of these open-plan carriages. So I'm buying my ticket, and there are two elderly lady lexicographers from the University Press who were going down to the theatre or something. And I said, when we get on the train, have I got a story to tell you? And so we sat on the train, and I was staying in a sort of, I guess, rather loud voice. I had a description of him sharpening the knife on a whetstone and tying a string as a ligature around his member, and then with one movement, and you could see all the men in the carriage crossing their legs with horror. And I said, you cut it off. But these women didn't gasp at all. They looked at me with a sort of basilisk stare, and you could see the sort of lexicographic gears grinding in their head. And they said, and I swear it was in unison, autopiotomy. And I said, I beg your pardon. They said, Well, peotomy is the amputation of the penis, but autopeotomy is, we think, a neologism. So if you get this in your book, then it'll be quoted in the 3rd edition of the OED, and your fame will be permanent.
And you did?
Yes.
That's beautiful.
I'm sorry, we should talk about the Pacific.
No, I pictured, as I reread that book just last week, I pictured that moment in the archives, and particularly as you described the pencil, right, the immediacy of that. I just thought...
You don't want to let it go.
No.
In any sense.
No. So this love of language and of the exquisite eye for that telling detail were among the great pleasures of that book and of all your books, including Pacific. For instance, in relating the story of the US captives in North Korea, you write about the morning of their release. It was 9 o'clock. They had had turnips for breakfast. It was snowing lightly. And reading that, I just felt that I could feel the pleasure that you must have felt in writing that, at just constructing those 3 exquisite little sentences that told you of their privation and of the circumstances in which they'd be crossing the bridge of no return, is it?
Yep.
And just set the scene. But the turnips for breakfast were just the touch. Now, I've asked Simon if he'd be prepared to read a passage from Chapter 4, speaking of North Korea. Chapter 4 is titled A Dire and Dangerous Irritation. Yes, my typewriter did something funny. Irritation, in which he pinpoints, as he puts it, the root of the nuisance that is North Korea today. Simon will take us back to 1945.
Yep.
An office in the Pentagon.
An office in the Pentagon with 2 young colonels. One, his name will be familiar to you, that's Dean Rusk, who went on to be Secretary of State in John Kennedy's administration. But the man who actually created North Korea had the most wonderful name. He was called, it's wonderful to think that an American created North Korea in the first place, but this man, super name, Charles Hartwell Bonesteel III. And they don't get better than that.
You don't.
And so the 2 colonels are in the office. Should I read this now?
Yes, do.
And they had a map. That's the important thing. The map was a large wall-mounted, small-scale, 552 miles to the inch at the equator, National Geographic Society map of the Pacific Ocean. It had been designed by the Society's legendary chief cartographer, Albert Bumstead, another rather nice name. And its photo lettering was designed by the equally famed typographer Charles Riddiford. The map was pinned up in the Pentagon office of George Marshall, who was then the Army Chief of Staff and who had used it to plan the movements of American forces in and around the ocean. In Washington, it was nighttime on August the 14th, 1945. 5 days before, the second atomic bomb had been dropped with devastating effect on Nagasaki, and Emperor Hirohito, in his thin, reedy, and hitherto publicly unheard voice, was on Japanese radio telling his people that the fighting was now over and that Japan would surrender, bringing the war in the Pacific to an end. Those listening in the Pentagon were relieved and satisfied, though it was a satisfaction muted by the sober realization that their supposed allies and friends, the Soviets, were now scything their way fast and furiously past the defeated Japanese units in Manchuria, on Sakhalin Island, and into Korea. And as the communist Russians did so, they were claiming immense new tracts of territory. Fear about the long-term implications of this land grab dampened any celebrations inside the Pentagon. The Cold War had not yet begun, but already strategists in Washington were supposing, correctly, that the communists had ambitions to mop up territories for themselves along the Pacific's periphery. Marshall's staff officers decided that night they must come up with immediate recommendations for the White House, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for halting the Soviets' advance. They first decided to establish a series of checkpoints around the region where the onrushing expansion might be stopped. One of these young officers then walked over to the wall map and pointed to the scantily known and, of late, Japanese-governed peninsula of Korea. That officer was the 36-year-old Colonel Charles Hartwell Bonesteel III, a third-generation soldier, a West Point graduate, and a Rhodes Scholar. Standing before the blue-washed expanses of the National Geographic map, he traced his index finger east and west across the entire breadth of the ocean, along a line of latitude that almost precisely joined the cities of San Francisco and the Korean capital, Seoul. Both of them lay some 37.5 degrees north of the equator. He observed an uncanny coincidence. He promptly declared that it was important for the city of Seoul, Korea's capital, to remain in American hands. He told his two colleagues in the room, one of whom, Dean Rusk, would become President Kennedy's Secretary of State, that the Soviet army should be requested to stop its advance just north of the capital. Since Seoul lay at 37.5 degrees, then the 38th parallel should do it, Bonesteel remarked with studied casualness. And then, using a grease pencil, he promptly drew a line clear across the map from Asia to California along the latitude line 38 degrees north of the equator. The officers told General Marshall what they recommended. Marshall thought the latitude line was perfectly reasonable and logical. Diplomats were told, and within hours, Moscow, to the astonishment of all, teletyped back the Soviets' concurrence. The Red Army would continue its sweep down into Korea, the message said, and would accept the surrender of all those Japanese forces on the peninsula stationed to the north of the 38th parallel. The United States could land its troops elsewhere and confront the Japanese occupiers to this line's immediate south. And that line, of course, is today the most heavily defended border anywhere in the world, and to the north of it is the Kim dynasty that have created now nuclear weapons and now a long-range missile to carry them. And to the south are 30,000 American troops in a perpetual state of war. If Bonesteel had not drawn that line, and Kim Il-sung in the north and Syngman Rhee or Lee Syngman had become the dictator in the south, there would have been no war, there would have been none of the nonsense that goes on today. Sure, the Korean peninsula would have become part of the Soviet Empire, would have become communist, but we've seen what's happened to communism almost everywhere in the world. It's withered and died. And Korea then would, in my view at least, have been an impoverished and socialist state, but it wouldn't be divided. No. And there wouldn't be 30,000 American soldiers there, and there wouldn't be lunatics like Kim Jong-un. So once again, the Americans, by interfering unwittingly, created a problem.
With a grease pencil, what's more.
In one grease pencil. And that map, I should say, is still in the National Geographic Museum.
That was my next question.
The source of it all, yeah.
Wow. And those names, Bumstead and Bonesteel. And you shortly tell us about a secret Navy spying program in the 1950s called Operation Beetle, which I also love. Tell us Bonesteel's lifelong nickname.
He was called Tick.
Tick. As in
Tick
Bonesteel.
But there is a sort of irony too. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of this bit about the release of the crew of the Pueblo in 1968. I mean, this was Operation Beetle, was when this pathetic little ship spying for the NSA was captured by the North Koreans, which is still a matter of great shame because you should go down with your ship. You shouldn't surrender a ship. And that ship is in Pyongyang. I mean, I've seen it. I've been to Pyongyang 2 or 3 times, and it's now there as a museum. However, still regarded in Washington as being USS Pueblo, as still a commissioned ship, but on temporary duty elsewhere. When finally they were released, just in time for Christmas 1968, and made that walk across the bridge of no return, each returning sailor was greeted, and this, remember, was 23 years after the creation of North Korea. The person that greeted them, they'd left a world of turnips and misery and torture. They were terribly badly treated. And they were coming across the line to be a world of, steak and orange juice and big hearty Americans and Christmas and freedom and all these good things. The officer who shook their hands was General Charles Hartwell Bonesteel III, the man that had inadvertently created the problem in the first place.
Oh, sweet irony. In talking about climate change in your book, which obviously can't be avoided in any context, but certainly not in that of the Pacific with its tiny islands, I like the way you round up your chapter with some optimism and something more than that, some real heart. You mentioned that some climatologists are of the view that the Pacific has the potential to absorb a good deal of the increasing heat from the sun, as well as excess of carbon emissions, which obviously is going to be harmful, but will save the land of the Earth to a large extent from worse than it might suffer. And the Pacific Ocean may eventually act as a giant safety valve for the Earth, and as you frame it, the Pacific Ocean as the world's pacifier. You say the thought is born of all too little science, but it is a thought endowed with poetry.
But there is some science there as well. I mean, yes, it's too late for a lot of countries in fact, if you saw the report that was issued yesterday, that was saying that we now expect 3 to 4 feet increase by the end of this century. And also, as you know, the temperature of the ocean is going up and the acidity of it's going up, which is killing the barrier reef and other coral reefs, which are, as it were, the canary and the coal mine of the world's environment. But the rising sea levels are undeniably going to damage countries like Kiribati. I still love the fact about Kiribati that because it extends across both the dateline and the equator, it's the only country in the world where it is both today, tomorrow, winter and summer, all at the same time. But they will have to leave, and the Fijians have said they'll take them in, and other countries will take them in too. And the poor Bikinians that were persuaded to leave their island are now miserably situated on an island called Kili in the south of the Marshall Islands, which is also being flooded. So they've had a double whammy. But the slightly optimistic note, and I didn't really write about this much in the Pacific book, I did in the Atlantic, relates to the discovery in the late 1980s, 1989 I think it was, of a creature we didn't know existed in the sea. It's got a horrible name, unfortunately. It's called Prochlorococcus, and it is a single-celled algae, and it floats in the upper 3 or 4 feet of the sea between about latitude 40 north and 20 south. And the thing about Prochlorococcus is, well, first of all, even though we didn't know it existed, it is the most numerous creature on this planet. There are more of them than anything else all put together. There are trillions upon trillions of them floating near invisibly in the sea. And what they do is they absorb carbon dioxide and they emit oxygen, such that 1 in every 5 of the breaths that we take here tonight will have been produced by Prochlorococci, something we didn't know existed as recently as 1989. But the wonderful thing about Prochlorococci is that they love warm water. The warmer the water gets, the happier they are, and they extend their range. So the warmer, although dire things are happening, and the Greenland ice cap and the Antarctic is melting, and people are being flooded, and El Nino is getting stronger, and the number of violent cyclonic storms is increasing, nonetheless, patiently, this creature that will eat up carbon emissions and spit out oxygen is increasing too. It strikes me as that wonderful theory, the Gaia theory, where the world is a self-repairing mechanism. Although we may be destroyed, and we're not going to exist for very much longer after all, but the planet itself, it seems to me, has a capacity to repair itself. All the things that the damage, it doesn't mean we should go out and buy, Escalades and things now, but the world has a way, at least in this particular arena, of repairing itself, which I think is a remarkable testament to the whole theory about Gaia. It has a beauty to it.
And there is poetry in that as well, not least because in some senses it seems to me to rhyme with the story of the Surgeon of Crowthorne. What was the name of that little creature again? It had a name that sounded somewhat like the
autopiotomy. Yes, Prochlorococcus. I know it has the word, yes, I know part of it may seem to echo
It's just an
did.
echo there. Somewhat poetic.
Yes, somewhat poetic.
I'm aware that this book came out late last year, which makes me think that, given how prolific you are, you must already be well advanced on your next project. Can you give us any clues about what we might expect?
Yes, although the publishers haven't totally signed off on it. I've got another meeting on the 18th of March when I get back to New York at 11 o'clock in the morning. I'm slightly biting my fingernails. But I very much want to write a book on the history of something which is it dominates all of our lives, and yet rather like the air and the language, it's something we've forgotten about, and that is, it'll be the history of precision. Precision is a concept that was invented effectively by 5 Englishmen in the end of the 18th century. John Wilkinson, Joseph Ramsden, Henry Maudsley, Joseph Bramah, and a fellow called Whitworth. And those 5 made the first perfectly flat piece of steel, the perfect sphere, the first screw thread. That was the Whitworth screw, is still used to this day. And Thomas Jefferson, then the American minister in Paris, saw this and saw the implications for the ability of these new engineers to make interchangeable parts. And that led to the establishment of the clock industry and the gun industry in America. And then it led to mass production, and then computers and lasers and all sorts of things. And so it dominates our lives, but does it dominate our lives too much? Are we becoming slaves to precision? And is, as a consequence, our respect for artisanal craftsmanship and so forth withering? Are we giving too much time and respect to titanium and forgetting the delights of bamboo? So that's the sort of overall thesis. But there are so many wild and wonderful characters in the book. I was just looking today, for instance, on the man who invented the Bic pen. Mm-hmm. So precise, the way that little tungsten ball fits in the top, and the way the ink keeps flowing. So it'll be full of, I hope, if they agree on the 18th of March.
They're going to love that.
Think of me at 11 o'clock on the
Just
morning.
Just ask us for a reference. You'll all buy it, won't you?
I hope, but it's slightly arcane, but I think it'll be great fun to do.
I think they'd love that. And I noticed that one of your pastimes is astronomy. Do you think you'll ever take your eyes off the landforms here and...
I don't know, but I should tell you one wonderful thing. I live in this funny old farmhouse in western Massachusetts, and I bought it in 2001, and I was out on a very, very snowy, bitterly cold January night looking at Saturn, because she happened to be up there. So I was out till about 3 a.m, and what struck me was that the farm is so remote that the sky, and there was no moon, it was perfectly black. The stars were like diamonds on velvet. There was no light pollution anywhere. And there was a tiny sort of smudge of light from a village called Winchester, about 15 miles away. But otherwise, nothing. The next morning, the previous owners of the house came by and said, "So, Simon, how did you like the house?" And I said, "Well, I love the house, not least because I discovered last night that the sky at night is perfectly black, ideal for watching stars." And they said, "Well, did we not tell you? Perhaps we should have done that. In 1902, this house was owned by the Reverend Charles Hawley, who in 1902, in this house, wrote the hymn, 'It Came Upon a Midnight Clear.'" So I thought that was just perfectly symmetrical.
How beautiful.
Good evening, Mr. Winchester. Thank you very much indeed for a very, very interesting discussion of your latest book. In that book, you say some less than flattering things about Australian politicians, and you alluded to it earlier. I think you used the term Neanderthals. Pauline Hanson and her aggressively populist policies. I wonder if you care to contrast that with what's going on in the election campaign in America at the moment, where another great Pacific nation, where again the 3 frontrunners seem to be running on a platform of extremely populist.
Believe you me, I hope the same fate befalls Donald Trump and company as befell Pauline Hanson. She went to prison, I think, shouldn't she? And I would love to see Donald Trump in prison. It is unutterably depressing. Here am I, a new member of this country, full of all the hope of any new immigrant. I'm proud of America. She's done wonderful, wonderful things in her 270-odd years of existence. But golly, this is, what a bunch of clowns. And not a single one on the Republican side seems to be... I obviously would never vote for any of them, and on the other side, Bernie and Hillary, Hillary it'll have to be, I suppose, but without a great deal of enthusiasm. My only sort of residual hope is that I think, except it'll split the ticket, is that Michael Bloomberg might run. And actually, I had a very flattering party given for this book about 3 weeks ago, and Bloomberg came to the party, which was a pretty nice thing for me to happen. And he talked quite candidly about it. He said if Bernie Sanders is the candidate, then he will definitely run. It looks like Sanders is not going to go. It looks like Hillary. And then he'll have a dilemma. Because obviously, if he did run, well, not obviously, that most votes he would take would be from the Democrats, which would then possibly allow the Republicans in, much as Ralph Nader did.
Yeah.
So it's a dilemma, but it's a horrible prospect.
It's a circus at the moment.
I think I'll look for another citizenship.
We'll have you.
Well, not Queensland. I don't think if Pauline Hanson is free.
I live in a country town, and it's still out there. The Hanson effect is still with us.
I did a long profile a long time ago about Joe Bjelke-Peterson, and what was his name? Rusk Hines.
Hinz, yep.
Hinz. What a character.
Yeah.
Boy,
those were times. We have a questioner upstairs, I believe.
Thanks very much, and thanks for a lovely discussion, and I really love the Pacific. I'm wondering, really, if you've envisaged doing the Indian Ocean and what will happen to Australia in that story.
Well, you know, I thought about doing the Indian Ocean, and of course the trade routes, the antiquity, it's fascinating, but I think, to be brutally honest about, in commercial terms, the Indian Ocean won't make it. It's just, it did have a certain logic, and if I were an academic, and certainly I think it's Routledge and Kegan Paul are doing a series of books on oceans by academics. David Armitage, who's a professor of history at Harvard, I think is overseeing them. They have done the Indian Ocean, and I've looked at that and I thought, there just aren't enough really good stories. I mean, there's Vasco da Gama, there's, of course, the Malaysian Airlines thing. Yeah. I mean, there are lots of stories, but it doesn't quite hang together. And I think the Western Indian Ocean on the African side and the Eastern side are very different in and of themselves. So I think the short answer is, well, my editor, who I have to say, and he's an extremely good and nice editor, he thought there was too much Australia in this book. He wanted the Australia chapter removed entirely, no mention of Cyclone Tracy, no mention of the Great Barrier Reef, and it was quite a long haul to get him to have it in the book.
Wow.
I think if he saw me writing about the Maldives and Diego Garcia and Mauritius and Reunion, I think he'd say, enough.
Forget about it.
So I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Where are some other questions? Let's see some hands. Over here, there's a gent.
Mr. Winchester, I just wonder if any one of your books surprised you in terms of its acceptance, or whether you thought, well, that's probably the question, which one of your books maybe surprised you as to how well they did?
Well, I think the professor or the Surgeon of Crowthorne amazed me. I mean, I did not think. I knew it was a good story. When I was in the middle of writing a book that I had wanted to write, well, I should back up. All my books before 1998 were complete commercial duds. I mean, I tried very hard, and I came up with what I thought were good ideas, and I thought the structure was reasonable, but the public didn't want to buy them. And yet the publishers still kept giving me another chance. And in 1997, I'd written a book about the Yangtze. I'd spent about a year traveling from Shanghai up to Gelandandong in Tibet and wrote a book called The River at the Center of the World, which I was very proud of, but it didn't do terribly well. But nonetheless, the publishers said, well, you know, give it another go. And so I came up with this idea of buying an old, rusty 800-ton tramp steamer and bringing it somewhat up to date and putting a crew on board of friends of mine who were competent, but nonetheless were caricatures of maritime animals, you know, a dyspeptic radio operator and a perpetually drunk chief engineer and whatever. And we'd set off round the world attempting to buy and sell things, run it as a working tramp steamer and go London to London or New York to New York via sort of silted up estuaries and forgotten islands and long overgrown ports, and write a sort of hymn to a vanishing maritime way of life. And so they liked that idea, and they gave me a reasonable advance, and I was actually about to buy, I had a certified check in my pocket to give to the ship owner in the Baltic. I'd found a particular ship off Bornholm Island in the Baltic and was going to buy it, and I had the crew all lined up, although mysteriously the very attractive young women that wanted to be the chefs said, well, we don't want to do the Bay of Biscay in November, we just want to do the Mediterranean in June. I said, if you sign on for the whole thing. But then I came across this story in a footnote in a book about readers of this book, which was a book about dictionaries, will of course be familiar with the story of W.C. Minor, the deranged American lunatic murderer who was a major contributor to the OED. And so I said, this book has got to be written. This is a wonderful book. And the editor who had commissioned the tramping book, she said, absolutely not. It's not a book. It's a magazine article. Just write it, for the New Yorker, 8,000 words tops. It's not a book. So when I did eventually write it, and I abandoned the tramp steamer in favor of this, I thought, this seasoned editor said, the book you intend to write is merely a magazine article. It will never make a book. That was what I thought. And then it started to sell, and then it never stopped, and, well, she's no longer my editor. But we're friends. She sort of rused that decision, I think.
And so you never did the tramp steamer?
No, I sort of continue to want to do it, but and I, funnily enough, it's how I sort of planned to. I did a book on Korea, which was similarly unsuccessful back in the mid-'80s, and I met a fortune teller as I was climbing up. There's a mountain in the south of South Korea called Hallasan, and a fortune teller. So this was in 1987, I think. I spoke very little Korean, and he spoke not a word of English. He asked for my hand. He looked at my hand. He knew nothing about me, but he said, you are a writer, which is pretty amazing, and you have written 8 books, which at the time was exactly right. He will say, you will write 28 more, you will be, which is more or less on target, you will be moderately well off and extremely happy and content, and you will die when you're 88. I mean, I've got a very specific, I know now, according to him, when I'm going to pop my clogs. And so, in that context, then, I thought the tramp steamer book should be the last one. So, when I'm sort of 87, I will do the book, and I'll arrange that I put it outside the lagoon off Bora Bora. And I will dismiss the crew, and I will write the book, transmit it to London, New York, and once the signal has come back that it's okay, have a big glass of Pinot Noir, a large cigar, open the seacocks. Sayonara. and he'll be right.
And the book will sell like hotcakes.
Well, yes.
Otherwise, a reality TV show would, on the same basis,
That'd
I think,
be
would be
nice.
terrific. Donald Trump may be interested.
Donald Trump maybe.
Yeah, he'd be
I hope
great.
that's all he's interested in.
We have a question over here, I'm sure. Am I right? Was there a hand? Yes.
Forgive me if I've missed something, but you said 2 things for a great book, like the idea, the structure. Was the third thing?
The third thing was the good writing. I'm sorry, I should have made it clear that the good writing is still important, but it's not the second most important thing.
Because I was wondering if it was character, because you tend to really like good
it's
characters.
It's nice to, with the kind of books I write, people like, although my editor tears his hair out, tangents. I love going in sort of weird directions, as I'm afraid this talk has rather demonstrated. But he hates it and says, can we stop with the footnotes, please, and just stick to the... So Henry and he doesn't like Australia. He's never been here, but he doesn't like the idea of it. Doesn't like tangents.
Doesn't like footnotes.
But I love him. He's a great editor.
But that's, the character... thanks for bringing the characters up, because I found it fascinating that in a book of something as vast, on the subject of something as vast as the Pacific, the way you bring people into the foreground, the way you balance that long and short focus so beautifully, that you do get those characters, even in a book which is about this massive ocean.
Well, you're right, and just looking at this precision book, if it gets to be written, just today I was looking at, I think it was Jesse Ramsden, who was a wonderful precision engineer in the must have been about 1790, I think. And he made scientific instruments, but he was an incredible, his personal life was a complete shambles, and he was very bad at timekeeping. He made beautifully exquisite roller bearings and cut perfectly precise gears, but he had no handle on his own personal timetable. And he had been commissioned to produce some kind of astrolabe, I think it was, for King George III. And he finished it, and he went down to Hampton Court, where the king was living at the time, and managed to talk his way past all the sentries. And finally, His Majesty welcomed him and said, "Ramsden, why are you here?" And Ramsden said, "I've got this astrolabe for you." And the king said, "Well, this is wonderful, but you are renowned as being the most unpunctual man in England. And the extraordinary thing about you is, Ramsden, that you have actually got the date perfectly right. The only problem is you've got the year totally wrong."
It's going to be a terrific book.
I hope so.
They'll give it a big tick, I'm sure. We have a couple of minutes left. Do we have one more question from the audience? Do I see any hands? I see a hand here. I see a hand there. Whoa. Oh, I'm leaving it to the person with the mic. Oh, she's chosen this one.
Mr. Winchester, no one has yet asked you about Bomb, Book and Compass, an absolutely fascinating book. Can you tell us a bit about your discovery of the story and writing of the book?
Although I have to say I loathe that title, which is not my title. It's called The Man Who Loved China, but Penguin called it Bomb, Book and Compass, so they thought The Man Who Loved China was too anodyne. What had happened was, I mentioned a few moments ago that I'd written a book about the Yangtze, and when I was researching it, I wanted to, as you probably know, there's this feature in the Yangtze called the Three Gorges, where the river is channeled between three ranges of mountains, and it flows with extraordinary power and rapidity through a series of very, very dangerous rapids. How does a sailing junk going from, let's say, Wuhan downstream to Chongqing upstream get up without the first person to bring power was not until 1912. So I was back in New York writing this book, and I needed to know, I wanted some pictures of the designs of Chinese sailing junks that were able to get through against the current, through the Three Gorges. And I had a friend who knew a lot about maritime stuff, and he said, well, there are two books you should get. One is The Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze by G.R.G. Worcester, published in Annapolis, Maryland in 1943, or Volume 4, Part 3 of Joseph Needham, Science and Civilization in China. I'd heard of neither of these books, but the next day I was up in Connecticut, in Salisbury, Connecticut, and there was a wonderful, wonderful bookstore called Lion's Head Books, owned by a man called Mike, I think, McIntyre. And he was one of these booksellers, like a bookshop I went to today, which I can't remember its name, which they knew everything. And it was secondhand and new books as well. And I said, Mike McCabe is his name, that's right. I said, Mike, 2 books. Sure, you don't know them, but you might know of them or where I can get them. The Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze. And without missing a beat, he said, oh, G.R.G. Worcester? And I said, yes. Oh, he said, we normally have a copy of that in stock. And reached up and took out, it was a sort of quarto volume, so a big thing, $25. And what was the other one? I said, it's a book called Science and Civilization in China by, and he said, Joseph Needham, of course. And I said, I think, he looked at me as if I was something that the cat had brought into the shop. He said, you've never heard of Joseph Needham? And I said, Michael, I'm terribly sorry, I haven't. He said, you should be ashamed of yourself. I mean, he is the most brilliant English historian that's ever worked in China. He produced the longest book in China in the English language ever produced, called Science and Civilization in China. And it's still in print, Cambridge University Press. You can get you can buy one from CUP, it'll cost you $10,000 or so. And we occasionally get single volumes in. And I think I remember a few years ago, there is one downstairs. And he went down like the White Rabbit, scuttling down, and came back a few moments later, blowing the dust off this great brick of a book. He said, yes, Science and Civilization in China by Joseph Needham, Volume 4, Part 3. $75, $100. I took them into the car, and it was pretty obvious what Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze were about. But this, 960 pages, It was called Nautics, everything about China's relationship with water. So it was about lighthouses and canals and lock gates and the design of sailing junks. And there were 23 other volumes on astronomy and zoology and chemistry and ceramics and medicine. I thought, who was this guy?
Yeah. So
that's when I started to get interested in him. And thank you for reading it. I loved that book, and I loved that man. He died in 1995. An extraordinary Morris dancing, sports car driving, nudist, cymbals player. Amazing.
Oh, not at the same time, I hope.
Chain smoker. Great lover of women. An extraordinary figure.
You need to get that one if you haven't read it. Now join me, please, in thanking Simon Winchester.
Thank you very much. Thank you.